Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtual Graphic Novel Club. My name is Erica.
And I'm Roland.
And we have the pleasure today of talking to you guys on the first day of February. Milestone Comics, which is a division of DC Comics. And we're going to start off Black History Month. Just give you guys a little history of Milestone. We usually come with a character or an event, but this month we're going to give you the history of the first Black publishing comic book company ever, and the deal that they made and where they are today. So we're gonna go through some history, and then we're gonna give you some of their most talked about characters and some of their most talked about team-ups. So we'll just kind of go back and forth, but yeah, I'll start it on off. Okay, Milestone was founded by, in 1993 by Dwyane Mcduffie, Dennis Callum, and Derek T. Dingle. Two other founders came, Michael Davis and Christopher Priest, later on. Derek Dingle was a business journalist. He's the guy that's on my right, probably your left, if you're looking at this. He was a business journalist that understood business and deal making and writing for magazines such as Black Enterprise and Money Inc. Dwyane Mcduffie, which is the man in the center there, he was the former editor at Marvel Comics in the late 1980s. During his time at Marvel, he and Callum, which is the man on the left or your right, who's one of the hottest artists in the comic book industry, created Deathlock for Marvel in I think it was '87. He was also Christopher Priest wrote for DC and Marvel. He was one of the first Black writers for both DC and Marvel. But he was frustrated to being regulated as the Black writer in the room. And so he kind of left comic books until he came on to Milestone. And Christopher Priest wrote for DC and Marvel. I've already talked about it. Michael Davis was a veteran artist who worked for both DC and Marvel back in the day also. These men created Milestone because they wanted to tell exciting stories about characters that look like them and others around them. You can create a character of color, but it can be hard to put yourself in their shoes. It is the little touches of what it may be like to grow up in a Hispanic or Asian household that only they know and can relate to. And Mcduffie, Callum, and Dingle pooled their money together. It was a total of $300,000 to open lines of credit to start Milestone. They met every Thursday evening in Callum's studio apartment for 6 weeks to create Milestone's range of multicultural superheroes. Callum and Dingle actually grew up together and read comics after school. Mcduffie and Callum met as they worked together at Marvel in the late 1980s. Before Milestone, there was comic book talents and there were people of color, but they did not stay in the predominantly white industries for long periods. There was a lot of hidden racism that they experienced writing for being in a room full of mostly male white writers and artists. In the 1960s and 70s, Marvel and DC both pushed to have introduce Black characters such as Black Panther and Storm for Marvel, and John Stewart, who was Green Lantern, and Black Lightning for DC. But these characters were created by white authors and drawn by white artists. And if a Black writer were in the room, it was usually only one, and they were usually the token. And the partners at Milestone wanted all to be represented in the room and to write and draw exciting characters and studies. So they weren't just looking to draw Black characters. They were trying to reach the masses and let people know that just because I'm a Black man or just because I'm a Hispanic man, I can still draw and tell stories. Right. And not only of that, as a person of color, I can also then give you stories from my point of view instead of stories of what a lot of times in this, especially in the 70s, you got characters like Luke Cage and even Black Lightning. That blaxploitation type of, it was told from a white point of view, and here's what a white man thought it was like to live in New York City, Harlem. And it was it was sometimes it was just as exploitation films were of the 70s, they were over the top. Your Pam Greers and your Foxy Browns and your Superflies. It was just over the top. Did we love those films, and did we find that movies exciting, and did we support them as yes, as a community we did, but
because it was the only thing that we had.
It was the only thing we had. And so and the same thing with comic books. We supported those characters even though they were drawn to be stereotypical, racially insensitive at times. And so these guys growing up reading those things and then coming back to create both Mcduffie and Callum being in the business, creating characters. And they not only wrote for, they not only created their own characters, but they also wrote for like Spider-Man and Batman. They wrote for all of them. So it wasn't like they had experience. Milestone inked a deal with DC that it's kind of compared to what an independent film company sees. Milestone would hire writers and artists to create characters and storylines. DC took care of marketing and distribution. In one of the articles I read, it compared it to Spike Lee's 40 Acres and a Mule type of deal he makes with studio. So he is his own production company, and just like they're their own publishing company, but they put a lot of the heavy lifting on the DC side. Yeah. The partners opened up an office space in New York City in June of 1992, and their first comic hit the streets in February of 1993. These partners wanted to show their product of multicultural characters and the worlds that they created. We'll get into some of the characters later. The problem was that being an independent publishing company without backing, sometimes it was doomed. The deal with DC gave them leverage in a tight industry. The principal investors, which was Mcduffie, Callum, and Dingle, owned equal shares of the business. They also hired 15 full and part-time employees and about 120 freelance talent. That's writers, pencilers, and painters. They also had a very lucrative arrangement with the staff. So if you work for them, any artist or writer that created characters with them received from any licensing and merchandising deal for that character. So if you created a character and there was merchandise or anything that was done, they got money off of that as an artist and as a writer. And Marvel and DC at that time controlled about 90% of the industry. In the mid-90s, going into the mid-90s, this was 92. So you just had Marvel and pretty much DC. Any of the smaller publishing companies were eventually bought out by one or the other. Very few still stand today. So the creators had 3 demands when they inked their deal with DC. They had, for number 1, it was total creative control. Number 2 was copyright ownership. And number 3 was final say in merchandising and licensing agreements. They also slipped the creative service fee into the contract, where DC paid the service fee of $500,000 or more for every comic book title that was created. Again, that's something from the movie industry with the independent movie, like when they put something out, the studio pays, it's like a back-ended kind of deal. They pay like $500,000 or more, whatever the contract says. But the typical rate was $500,000. Time Warner was the parent company of DC at the time. Time Warner acquired DC in 1989, and they helped leverage Milestone. So 89, and then Milestone comes along in 92. In the business industry, so Time Warner was the name that everybody paid attention to. Yes, DC was big, but Time Warner was the name that people were paying attention to. And because of this, Milestone got better deals and partnerships. An example of this is Warner Consumer Products helped Milestone land an agreement with Skybox International. a leading producer of non-sports trading cards at the time. Kind of made me think of, remember the like garbage can kids trading cards and stuff, like things like that, or what we would they consider Pokemon cards, but I don't think Pokemon cards were out back in '92. So I think of Garbage Pail Kids, though. That was my generation. So yeah, but and because of this, of being affiliated with Time Warner Media, Milestone got this deal. And they also got better shelf space than most independent comic publishers at the time. So I know some of us can't think about this, but at one point in time, in order to get a comic book, you had to either get it directly mailed to your house through direct mail, or you had to go to a bookstore or comic book store, or you had to go to a newsstand if you were in a city that had newsstands, and they sell comic books too. And who got the prime real estate? Like, it's like going into a bookstore now. Your bestsellers get your prime real estate. Well, 90% of the market at the time was held by Marvel and DC. But because they were an offset of offset of DC, it put their books at eye level for people to see. So people are now seeing these characters that they created. And yes, they're African-American characters, but they weren't, because they had that DC label, you're not saying that this is an African-American publishing company that's books just for African-Americans. And don't get me wrong, they had some, when they did premiere their books, some of their earliest readers, it was like John Singleton, the director, John Singleton, and even, and this was funny to me, U.S. Justice Clarence Thomas was a big reader of Milestone comics. He may have liked, what's his name? We'll talk about him, the conservative lawyer. And so people got to see their characters in their books and not know that Milestone was an African-American publishing company, and saw them as just books that was being created by DC. And they were now seeing African-American characters in prominent places. And so the principal investor also had technical roles in the company. So you had McDuffie, who was editor, and he oversaw every book from start to finish. Davis was the business side, and he did all the business because of his background. And he also kept his day job. He also continued to write for Money Inc. And Callum was responsible for nurturing all incoming talent because he was the artist side of it. They saw immediate success when doing this. In 1993, it was a boom year for all comics. It was a time when people were investing their savings into comics. They were buying these limited edition series. The one I can think of is Death of Superman, which was a huge thing. People were buying multiple copies of this stuff. So some comic sales were booming, but we also know with any boom, these comic books were also in trouble. DC was in trouble, hence the acquiring by Time Warner in 1989. But also on top of that, Marvel was in trouble too. Marvel was trying to get their footing. They didn't have a principal backer at that time like DC did. And they started around this time selling off the rights to a lot of their, they did get the Fox deal because they started doing cartoons for like Spider-Man and X-Men for Fox. So that was going on behind the scenes. Davis, who had become the director of talent, he left Milestone in 1994. He was one of the ones that came along. He wasn't a principal backer, but he was one of the early creators. And he left in 1994 to go to Motown Animation and Filmworks. They wanted to produce multicultural comics also at Motown, and they wanted to do animated things, which I think I don't know what they did with that. Who knows? They probably did, and we probably never knew it was Motown. In 1994, many of the small publishers that were around went bust around this time. So if they weren't acquired by DC or Marvel, they kind of disappeared. In Also, but that summer from 1994, that summer, they did a joint publishing effort with DC characters and created Worlds Collide. The series was 14 books and it sold 1.8 million copies, which was very good. This boosted Milestone even more. So now 30 to 50% of their sales increased from being crossed over into the DC world. So people are seeing those characters and they're like, oh, I want to read about Icon or I want to read about Icon and Rocket or Hardware. So their sales increased 30 to 50% depending on the title. And the comics industry was experiencing a remarkable increase in sales in preceding years. They had featured work of several well-known and critically acclaimed creators and used a coloring process that gave their books a distinctive look. And as we go through some of the slides, you'll kind of see that look. So like the one on the left, that's the Milestone hat that, isn't that Static? The early Static.
Static was strong.
Oh, yeah, okay. But that's the Milestone logo. And their coloring process was distinct and they had the potential appeal to an audience that other publishers were not targeting. But they also suffered from several disadvantages. The comic market was experiencing a glut of new universes around this time too, and several publishers launched superhero lines around the same time. A slump would start in 93, but the market crash wasn't until 94. So when Milestone is here, seeing their heights and their uniqueness being praised, the entire comics market is experiencing it's a mayhem. It's passion and burden. Many retailers and readers perceived that Milestone books were comics for quote unquote blacks and assumed that they would not be interested in African American and non-African American readers, which was not true because their worlds were multicultural. And the books received limited exposure beyond the existing comic shop customers. The coloring process also added a slightly to the cover price. So their books were a little bit more expensive just due to how they were coloring things. And Cohen talks about that a lot in interviews that he does because they were so different. But he was also always known for his unique style. Recently, I didn't get a chance to include any of these, but he did some one-of-a-kind limited edition Black Panther movie posters for the movie when it was released in 2018, and it was all designed and done by him. And it's still that same style that he uses. And so it made their comics a little bit more expensive. And overall comic sales around this time peaked at the time when Milestone launched and declined dramatically in years following. So initial sales were decent, but not as high as other companies, which is understandable. Milestone canceled several lower selling series in 1995 and 1996 and aborted plans for several miniseries around this time. Heroes, a routine book features of Static and several other popular second-tier characters was launched, but failed to sell well enough to justify an ongoing series. And unfortunately, Milestone shut its doors in the comic book division in 1997, but some of the remaining ongoing series discontinued in mid-story. It became a licensing company primarily focusing on Emmy Award winning and a humanitarian prize winning animated series, Static Shock. So the only one who survived was Static. He was super popular with the youth of the 90s. And at the end, Milestone, Dwyane Mcduffie, one of the founders, he wrote for Static Shock. He continued to write for Static Shock, and he oversaw the animated series for the WB Kids. He also worked on Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, the animated series, adding more female and multicultural characters to the quote unquote boys club of the Justice League. He did pass away in 2011 from complications of a heart surgery at the age of 49. So he is the only one that's no longer with the group. Dennis Callum continued to create for Marvel and DC after Milestone went kaput. He recently resurrected Vic Sage, which is AKA The Question, in 2019 for DC's Black Label. He also is bringing Milestone back under DC again as Milestone Media. After some legal battles, Milestone will get its iconic characters such as Static Shock, Icon and Rocket, and Hardware in 2021. Those have all been published. They're all digital right now, coming in graphic novel form, probably in 2022, probably this year. But yeah, you can read them. I know you can read them on DC Universe, or whatever it's called now. Yeah, I think it's DC Universe. And in 2010, DC released a limited series titled Milestone Forever, taking place in the original Milestone universe. Actually saw that one. It is on DC's comic book platform. It detailed the final fate of several of the Dakota heroes. So when we're talking about these characters, you'll hear Dakotaverse a lot. That's where these characters are from. They're not from the DCU, they're from the Dakotaverse. Just like the Arrowverse and all, when we talk about like that, for the CW characters. It is revealed that the events that led to the early merger into the DC universe as of 2021, Milestone is coming back if you're interested. DC Comics and Milestone Media are back with a fellowship that will announce the winners in February 2020, which is this month. The fellowship invited writers and artists to come and work for Milestone Media to create existing character content and new content for the media group. So be on the lookout for that this year because they've
actually already started. They actually have artwork and everything going up in cities around the nation.
Yeah.
I don't know if I added those pictures to the slideshow, but I should have. I came across some pictures where they had artists come out, and in communities, what they did, like there's several,
just to kind of get people
several things of Static, especially Static is one of the biggest characters that they utilize. But they did use Icon and Rocket as well.
Icon and Rocket is the one I see a lot on the DC Universe platform, like the comic platform when I'm opening it up to read it. That's one of the first ones that they highlighted, especially last summer, June 2021, when they debuted their first issue again. And so, Icon and Rocket was one of the ones they were really pushing. And I've yet to read it, but I will.
All right. Well, look, without further ado, let's get into Earth M. And their first character that these people put out was Hardware. And his first appearance was February 1993 in Hardware #1. The story is the story of Curtis Metcalf, who was a child prodigy from a working class neighborhood born to Mitchell and Denise Metcalf. At age 12, a famous inventor named Edwin Alva took notice of his gifts and developed a personal interest in him. Alva paid his way through the top schools in the country. There, Kurt graduated from high school at age 14 and got his first college degree at 15. After completing his education on scholarship, the only requirement was to work at Alva Technologies, where he was given an enormous salary, his staff, and the freedom to work on anything he wanted. This paid off, and his inventions made millions of dollars for the company. Throughout his life, he considered Alva to be the closest thing he had to a friend and more of a father than his own dad had ever been. Believing he should receive a higher share of the profits he generated, Curtis asked Alva for a pay raise and found out what the older man really thought of him. Alva had no respect for Curtis as anything other than a useful servant and regarded their relationship as dog and master. Enraged, Curtis tried to quit his position, but was contractually obliged to never work for a competing company. Instead, he turned to blackmail. Searching for blight on Alva's record, he instead discovered that his boss was a complete monster who was also a significant figure in the underground international crime network called System. After submitting the evidence he had found to the proper authorities, Curtis was completely ignored. The level of power and corruption Alva had achieved permeated the legal system and made it impossible for him to be taken down by conventional means. Instead, Curtis decided to bring him down himself. Making use of the vast technological resources at his disposal, he created an advanced suit of armor that allowed him to fight against the criminal enterprises of his enemy by night, using the alter ego hardware. Alva struggled every night against the high-tech dreadnought, unaware that he is funding his own arch nemesis, who operates out of his basement. From the beginning of his career, Hardware battled with all types of villains, most of whom were hired by Alva to kill him, from the body-doubling assassin Reprise to the tech-inspired Technique. None of them could best the armored Avenger. Within months, Hardware relentlessly picked Alva's organization to pieces, costing him millions of dollars. However, one day, when Alva discovered Hardware's true identity and appeared in his hideout, Alva's original rage turned into something else. Impressed by Curtis' tactical abilities and courage to stand up to him, Alva made him a stunning offer. In return for Hardware's protection and occasional help, Curtis would be made his second in command, allow him to dismantle Alva's criminal organization. Curtis accepted the deal, believing he could shut down the bad parts of Alva Industries and system the easier way. And this is the character Hardware, who had a run of 1993 to 1997.
Okay.
Now, one of the next up was the Blood Syndicate, whose title was released in April 1993. And they did a run from 93 to 96. Basically, most of the members received their powers in the Big Bang that took place in the city of Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, this happened when the tear gas was laced with quantum juice and was used to dispel a massive gang riot. It killed many, but it unlocked a lot of their metagenes, the people who survived. And basically, those surviving few, because they were gang members, at first they had tension amongst themselves. But what it is, they ended up coming together as like a Uber gang, basically, to do good. Yeah. They decided that violence wasn't going to be their way, but then they realized that there were others who didn't think like that, so they were going to have to meet violence with violence. Yep. So what ended up happening is you had the remnants of the Paris Island Bloods and the Force Syndicate. And so their title being a compilation of both names, you get the Blood Syndicate. Lack of stability within the team led to their eventual disbanding.
Makes sense.
All right.
All right, next on the list, we have this Icon, and of course, Rocket is next to him, but Icon was from 1993 to 1997, first appearance in May of 1993. In 1839, an alien starliner malfunctioned and exploded, and a jettison of a lifeboat crashed into the middle of a cotton field in the American South. Sounds familiar up until a point. And it sounds like the story of Superman up until that point. The pod automatically altered the appearance and the passenger named Arnis to mimic the first sentient life form who discovered him. That life form was a slave woman named Miriam, who saw the pod crash land. It also happened that Miriam found inside a baby boy with her mother's eyes. In the present, Arnis is still with us. He did not age visibly beyond adulthood. To disguise this fact, he periodically assumes the identity of his own son. By the late 20th century, he's posing as Augustus Freeman IV, the great-grandson of the original human identity. Still marooned, Augustus awaits for Earth's technology to catch up to his life pods. Secretly possessing superpowers that belly his human appearance, he always performed quiet acts of charity. But one night, Augustus' house is broken into, and he uses his powers for the first time in decades. And a witness, Raquel Irvin. Raquel is an idealistic teenage girl who was born in Paris Island, the poorest, most gang-ridden neighborhood in Dakota. Her prospects veer bleak until the chance encounter with Augustus. And seeing him use his powers, Raquel persuaded Augustus to become a superhero named Icon, with herself being his sidekick, Rocket. Augustus is portrayed as very intelligent and somewhat stiff kind of person due to his upper-class job as a big-time lawyer and the proper way of speaking. He is often criticized as a sellout and a whitewash. He usually prefers to do everything by the book instead of acting on instinct, and is a non-sympathetic of any wrongdoing. During the majority of the series, Icon mostly fought plain street criminals and those who gained powers from Dakota's Big Bang. The most famous man on our list, and that is Static, who ends up being called Static Shock. As you can see, you got the DC logo on the left and the Milestone logo on the right. So that really helped. Static Shock appeared in June of 1993, so they're just banging him out like one after the other. That was his first appearance. 15-year-old Virgil was known as a social outcast, a status he shares with Chuck, Rick, and Felix due to not only his gifted intellect, but also because of his interest in comic books, role-playing games, and science fiction. He maintains his friendship with the popular Larry and harbored a crush on Frida, unaware that she's dating Larry. Because of his ostracism, he's often bullied and is typical for an adolescent. When trying to stand up for Frida, Virgil took a serious beating from Martin Scarponi, known as Big Money B, until Larry stepped in, hurt and humiliated one too many times, made even worse by Sharon and her friends tormenting. He was given a gun by Larry, who encouraged him to seek revenge on Martin at the docks during the gang war on Paris Island that night. Virgil arrived at his former home and hid behind some crates of old drugs. Despite being tempted to murder his bully, he ultimately chose not to shoot someone in cold blood. Not long after throwing the gun away, the police arrived and used a special tear gas under the belief that radiation marker, which means for tracking the gang members in case they tried to escape. Unfortunately, the gas served only to either kill those present or mutate them, in the event known as the Big Bang. So this is what the crime syndicate do. Okay. Exposed to the gas while trying to escape, Virgil immediately gained a variety of electromagnetic powers and managed to flee the chaos unscathed on a trash can lid. Practicing his new abilities and inspired by his interest in comics, he decided to become a superhero himself, calling himself Static. As Static, he no longer faced just common thugs and criminals, but also the Bang Babies, such as Laserjet, the Swarm, and Commando X, and Holocaust, who becomes one of the most dangerous enemies. During this time, he meets other Dakota heroes such as Icon and his sidekick Rocket, Hardware, and the heroes of which Static himself is a reserve member. Static also has civil relationships with the Blood Syndicate and a tense one with the Shadow Cabinet, and we haven't talked about it yet. He would also find an ally in Captain Gil Summers, who recognized Static as a necessity for the Bang Baby related crimes. Faced with godlike entity Rift, that saw two worlds coming together, Static meets up and teams up with Superman, Superboy, and Steel to defeat the villain. Playing a pivotal role in doing so, once the crisis is subverted and the worlds are again split, Static expresses disappointment apparently that the heroes apparently weren't real, having been a fan of the comics since his childhood. That is Static.
All right, so next up, we have the Shadow Cabinet. Their first appearance, Shadow Cabinet number 0, January 1994. The Shadow Cabinet was led by the precognitive Dharma. They attempt to neutralize potential threats to the world while they are still relatively small and manageable. Their methods are controversial and often underhanded. Although many more traditional mainstream heroes often team up with the Shadow Cabinet, they also frequently come into conflict with others on both sides of the law. They operate on an international basis, and their full agenda is only known to their leader at any given time. They first revealed themselves to the contemporary heroes of the world during the Shadow War, when there was a sudden mass recruitment drive to help combat a faction that had succeeded from the cabinet called the Star Chamber. Although the Shadow Cabinet was originally, as a Milestone media feature, a part of the Dakotaverse, they have recently been integrated into the mainstream DC universe, introduced in a conflict with the Justice League of America. And that is the Shadow Cabinet. one of their next. Well, you know what? Hold on before you change it. This basically the reason why I have this title up here twice is because the Milestone's first crossover event amongst all of their internal comics was the Shadow War.
Okay.
And in this Shadow War that's when we get introduced to the Shadow Cabinet, but you also get introduced to the other characters who have already been put out, as far as Icon, Static, you know,
Hardware.
so, and Hardware. So there's all of them come together in this first crossover event in 1994, which also introduces the Shadow Cabinet. All right, next up, we have the first title that followed, the Shadow War. And in January 1994, Milestone Comics released Zombie number 0. David Kim was once a Korean-American scientist who was from West Orange, New Jersey. He developed a nanotechnology virus capable of regenerating tissue. Now, his life changed when a villain known as Dr. Sugarman broke into his lab to steal the virus. During a fight after he broke in, Kim was injured real bad, but his life was saved when his assistant Kelly injected him with the virus that he created. This was kind of good and bad because basically it saved his life, but what it ended up doing, the virus managed to devour Kelly when he laid his body on her lap. So in essence, it healed him, but it killed her because it was eating organic matter. From that day on, Daniel became zombie due to him being basically turned immortal and being able to devour others in order to live. This had led him to come in conflict with various supernatural entities that secretly lived amongst humans for millennia in other realms called the Shadow Rift. And
so he basically can't touch anybody.
Well, he can control it.
Oh, okay.
He can control it. And what ends up happening is he's an immortal character because if he gets damaged or injured in any type of way, the nanites in his body rebuild his body. In order for him to keep those nanites effective and alive, though, sometimes he has to devour other organic material.
Nice. All right, next on the list is Cobalt. First appearance, June 1994. Cobalt is an ongoing comic series that was published by Milestone Media and released by DC Comics. The featured character is Cobalt. Get him there. He's an anti-hero who developed a ruthless and fierce reputation for himself. Some criminals even believed that he was a cannibal. Formerly a partner of the superhero known as Clover, Cobalt carried a vendetta against the villainous St. Cloud organization. He starts to harass some of the employees of St. Cloud into fighting him, and after battle, Cobalt learns that another vigilante, Clover, several of Cloud's men are manipulating his organization for profit and other sinister purposes without Cloud being aware of it. So despite this, Cobalt refuses to team up with Clover, and he insists on no new partners ever. We soon learn that he had at least once before who managed a very illegal phone line that he knew about. One of these people was the father of Paige, and in that superhero groupie, Cobalt owes Paige his father and calls this in, wanting him to train his son to be a genuine superhero. Later, Paige is videotaped battling the villain Slick in an incident involving a seemingly empty armored car. This is caught on video, learning the criminal world, and Paige's father sees the fight and regrets his decisions to allow Paige to be a superhero. St. Cloud himself realizes Cobalt is real and not just an excuse for his employees to use cover of their own incompetence. Cobalt himself believes that his reputation as a demonic force is absolutely ruined. Increased resistance in the later battle supports this theory in Cobalt's mind, and this train of thought is interrupted by the appearance of Hardware. He has not appeared since the Dakotaverse became a part of the DC universe, and Cobalt was of Cuban descent. So,
all right.
Kind of has like a Aquaman.
Yes.
I don't know if it's a sword or Lance, I don't know what that is.
So next up, it's not a character, but we have a series that ran from 96 to 96, basically because it was cut off because of lack of sales.
Yeah.
But the Heroes was a short-lived team of superheroes that was composed mostly of former Shadow Cabinet members, led by Starlight. The series took several of the Shadow Cabinet's more appealing members and put them in a more traditional superhero team along with Static, a popular solo character. As Milestone's overall sales continued to decline, it was changed to a limited series. Milestone canceled the remainder of their ongoing series shortly thereafter. Heroes was notable for including Donner and Blitzen, an openly lesbian couple in an otherwise mainstream superhero series. The team consisted primarily of refugees from the Shadow Cabinet, a covert organization dedicated to saving humanity from itself through questionable means. Fed up with that mode of operation, they and some allies established themselves as an above-ground superhero team named basically the Heroes.
Donna and Blitzen, that's it. Like the reindeer. Like the reindeer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me jump right on into this, these next two. Okay, so in the summer of '94, now this is an event that ran from July to August. It ran across all of the Milestone titles, and it ran across a few DC titles as well. And these were some of the bigger titles, as Superman and say again.
It's like the super team, Superman, Superboy,
Right.
Steel. Yeah.
So the basic synopsis for Worlds Collide was it's about a postal worker named Fred Benson who unwittingly becomes a portal between two worlds and two cities, a living link between Dakota, the home city of the Milestone Heroes, and Metropolis, home of Superman. Eventually, Benson loses control of his powers and transforms into Rift, a cosmic being capable of manipulating and reconfiguring matter on a subatomic scale. The heroes of the two universes come together to stop him and seal the dangerous rift between their worlds. The situation was somewhat complicated by the fact that in the Dakotaverse, DC superheroes such as Superman were known as fictional characters from comic books. Although the crossover initially had no lasting consequences in DC continuity, because DC's Zero Hour event canceled out everything that came before, it was remembered by the Milestone superheroes.
Okay.
All right. The last event that Milestone put on that happened between July and September 1995, and again, this was across the Milestone comics. It was called Long Hot Summer. And it basically took place in a newly built area of Dakota City called Utopia Park. And it's here that tensions rise that basically cause conflict in the whole city. A new anti-gang task force called Grind declared war on the Blood Syndicate. And at the same time, the construction of Dakota's Utopia theme park displaced a lot of residents of Paris Island to some hastily constructed projects. Basically, with the social upheaval going on in Dakota City in this area, it comes basically down to Zombie Icon, Hardware, Rocket, and the Blood Syndicate to try to contain the riot started by the displaced residents. And pretty soon, all of Dakota's heroes are pitching in to save the city and its citizens. And this is the event called the Long Hot Summer, which was one of their last full-length events.
Yeah. Before 1996 and everything.
Right.
97, I'm sorry, it's when they closed doors. And this is the other media that they're in. I mentioned before, McDuffie won a few awards working on Static Shock, the TV series that ran from 2000 to 2004. Some of you may remember it. I know you could watch it. You used to could watch it on the DC Universe platform, but I don't know where it's at now. But it was loosely based on the comic Static. This by Milestone, this Virgil Hawkins looks a little bit different from that Static He's a student at Dakota City as a result of an accidental exposure to a mutagen known as the Big Bang. He gains ability to control and manipulate electromagnetism. He uses these powers to become the superhero Static, and his character. This is the most well-known character of the Milestone universe that crossed over into the DC universe. And 2020 was the return of Milestone Comics, Milestone Media. Milestone Returns was published in September 2020, and now into present. The extended version was published in February 2021, and this reboot is a rebooted continuity from the famous characters like Static, Icon, Rocket, and several others, and they all have new origin stories related to the Big Bang event that happened to Dakota City. And while they still don't know each other, the Ignatic Dharma prepares them in secret for war to come. Okay. Icon and Rocket, which was released last summer, July 2021. I mentioned them earlier. The new updated look here. This review flagship titles for the milestone of the 1993 debut. Icon follows Arnis as from being another planet who is taken in the form of an African American man and has abilities such as flight, super strength, and vulnerability. He uses this partnership with Rocket, a human teenager, using his alien technology to protect the people of the fictional city of Dakota.
And you said they put her front and center.
This time, yeah. And she was kind of in the past.
Yeah, well, I mean, she was front and center in the first book, but the title did not.
Yeah, it just said Icon.
Right.
But yeah, it's Icon and Rocket. And like I said, they will be releasing the graphic novel this year of 2022. So, and that is it. And please do check out some of the works that we cited. It's just now that they've come back with Milestone Media, you'll be able to buy and purchase some of their new stuff and some of the stuff that they're going to be coming up with. So yeah, check out our works cited and some of these things for yourself. And so we've got all of our great information from. And also do check out Comics Plus. You can borrow and read thousands of digital comics and graphic novels and manga from Clayton County Library System with Comics Plus. With your Clayton County Library card, there's no holes, no waits, and you get to offline access on your tablet, computer, or smartphone. You can download and you can sign up with your account today with your library card. If you do not have a library card, come on and visit one of the 6 branches that are open at this time. And in 2 weeks, please join us as we celebrate Marvel, and we will be celebrating an iconic figure here.
Mr. Sam Wilson.
Mr. Sam Wilson, who is AKA Falcon, AKA Captain America also. So this is his classic look, what we all know is MCU look. Like that.
That's a whole lot better.
Yeah, I mean, not with his chest out. And, the leotard and the frilly,
like a circus set.
Yeah. Hey, it was the 70s. Okay. But please join us February 15th at 4 p.m. You can join us on our Clayton County Library System YouTube page. We go live at 4. And you can check out some of our other stuff. If you like today's entry, please check out last year's. We did a whole collection of Marvel, DC, African-American villains and heroes of the DC and the Marvel universe. So if you like this, you can check out last year's entry that we have. It's on our YouTube page. So we will see you guys in 2 weeks.